Today we are going to be talking about the camera I've had for 1 year now, the Panasonic Lumix G7. Hello everyone and welcome back to IB Films. If you're new around here, we make videos about all things filmmaking and these tech reviews like today's video. So like I mentioned, I've had the Lumix G7 for 1 year now, so I've had plenty of time to work with the camera and I found things I like and don't like about it. So let's get right into it. And if you'd like to get your own Lumix G7, there will be links down below. Also, disclosure, I'm not sponsored by anyone. No one sent this to me. I have 30 subscribers, so why would anyone do that? I don't know. So let's talk about the price and what you get with that price. So you can get the Lumix G7 new for about $500. So that means for $500 you can get the camera body that shoots 4K and a lens, which is still an incredible deal, especially since this camera came out in like 2015. And really, the only camera that comes close in competition is the Canon M50, but we'll talk more about that later. Now let's talk about the resolution options. The Lumix G7 can shoot Full HD at 24, 30, and 60 frames per second, and 4K at 24 and 30 frames per second. Now let's go over the actual physical body of the G7. So now it's time to go over the physical body of the G7, which means now I have to take it off this stand and start filming on my phone again, so sorry about that. Let's just not make this awkward or anything. And now we have the G7. So, yes, here's the physical body. Sorry again, I'm on the phone. I know it doesn't look as great, but I don't have two cameras, so deal with it. So let's go over the physical body. On the front, we have the lens button, so you can press this to take off your lens. On the left, we have a 3.5mm microphone jack and a hot shoe mount on front, so you can set up a mic, plug it into the camera, and put it on top if you're doing more of a vlogging style or just kind of these talking head videos too. On the right, we have all the connections, so micro HDMI, remote shutter jack, all the little ports things. On the bottom, we have the battery and SD card slots. On the top, we have an aperture dial, shutter dial, 2 mode dials, a dedicated record button, shutter button, and 2 programmable function buttons, and the on and off switch, of course. And on the back of the camera, there's a lot. The first thing is there are 4 programmable function buttons on the back of the camera. Next, we have a flash button, which I've never used, but hey, you might. We have the focus select, so you have autofocus set, autofocus continuous, and manual focus. There's also your display button, so you can change the display, and the playback button so you can watch your videos. There's also an ISO, white balance, and focus button, and a menu button. So that is the physical body of the G7. It has a ton of stuff packed onto it. So now let's get on to the rest of the video. So now that we've gone over some of the basics, let's talk about some cons. So now we're going to talk about the cons. And no camera's perfect, and unfortunately the G7 is no exception. But strangely enough, for this little budget beginner camera, there's not that many flaws with it. So first of all, and this is probably one that everyone talks about, is the autofocus. Now, I'm not using the autofocus because it's bad. So if you were to compare this to a Canon or Sony camera, which have really good face detection autofocus, it would just blow it out of the water. So Panasonic uses what they call a contrast-based autofocus. So if there's a higher contrast in the distance or in the shot, the camera will warp and try to figure out what should be in focus and what shouldn't, which is really sucky because it will find your face and it has no problem finding it and try to figure out what should be in focus. But this isn't a huge problem for filmmakers who are probably going to be using manual focus anyways. That's what I do, and right now, I have it on manual focus and I just have it set on me. Another thing is the sensor size. It is a micro 4/3 camera, and this has a few flaws, really just kind of nitpicky stuff. Preferably, I like micro 4/3. I don't see a huge problem with it, but the problems is it doesn't have as much low light capabilities as full frame, and you don't get that super shallow depth of field you would see on full frame or even an APS-C sensor. But if that is truly a big deal to you, you can get a speed booster, which will let you put big lenses on there, like full frame lenses, and then you get that shallow depth of field and better low light. So it's a win-win. And the last negative that actually kind of is a negative for me is that the fact that you can't really do heavy color grading to the footage. If the more you do and you try to pull out colors and stuff, it just becomes kind of a pixelated mess. And this is the only thing that actually bothers me, and it's probably why I'll upgrade eventually. But even this has a workaround. Right now, I'm just using the Vivid picture profile, and so I think it looks okay. I think it looks good enough for these types of videos, and it's not awful. So again, this camera has some flaws, but it has some workarounds if you are willing to be a little more creative. So that's all for the cons, thank goodness. Now let's get to the rest of the video. Now let's go over some of the pros and other features that make this camera so good. So now we get to talk about other features I really like and some more pros, and this is what I'm actually excited for because I hate saying bad stuff about my camera. So some of the great features are like video centered stuff. So there's focus peaking. Focus peaking is when you're in manual focus, whatever you set your focus to, there'll be I have mine just set to blue. I think it's blue by default, so there'll be blue lines and blue dots on what's ever in focus. So this is really helpful. Like, I know I'm in focus right now. I have all these blue lines around me, and so it's saying I'm in focus. This is great for filmmaking, and just everything about it basically means you don't need autofocus. Another great thing is zebras. So if you were to point the camera at something that's super bright, like outside at the sun, or even just through a window, or just really bright light, you can set on zebras, and these are like zebra lines or diagonal lines that will tell you that that part of the image is overexposed. So this is great. Lets you know it's overexposed, so you can turn down your exposure settings, turn down your ISO, and stuff like that. And one of my all-time favorites about this camera is the customization. I think this camera has 11 programmable function buttons. Some of those are on the touch screen, and some of them are on the physical body itself. So this means that you really can turn this camera into whatever you need. So like you can have Wi-Fi setting, which we'll talk about in a second, and you could set like focus peaking, you can set your zebras on, so you just tap a button and it's ready to go. And this really makes the G7 just stand out from the rest of the competition. And also, the last thing we're going to be talking about in this section is the Panasonic app. This app you can get on your phone, on your tablet, on any device really. And what it does is it allows you to completely control your camera from your phone or from wherever you got the app from. So I have like a button, so I click that and it has the Wi-Fi set up. My phone will connect to that Wi-Fi, and then I can set my focus. If I'm too far from the camera, I can set my focus from my phone. I can change my ISO. I can change my aperture. Pretty much everything about the camera. This is super helpful, especially if you're a solo shooter and you can't physically reach the camera. And this is just, that's one of my favorite things about it. It's so good. It's so convenient, super helpful. Now, back to the rest of the video. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about why I think this is a good filmmaking camera, not necessarily a vlogging camera. As I mentioned before, some of the cons, like the bad autofocus, can make people really scared of using this, but if you're going for more filmmaking, you'll usually use it in manual focus and pull your own focus. And low light's not a big deal because you'll probably be bringing your own lights. But if you really want some great colors and great autofocus, maybe you should go with the Canon M50. Again, if you're doing more like vlogging or straight up YouTubering, the Canon M50 is probably the better choice for you. But for filmmakers, G7. Now let's talk a little bit about the upgrade path of the Panasonic cameras, and this is where they really shine. So for about $500, you get the Lumix G7. For like $600, you can get the G85, which has a few nicer features that the G7 doesn't have. And so that's really good for starting out because you'll get 4K video for $500 or $600 depending on which camera you get. And for $1,000, you can get the Lumix G9, which has a ton of video features, including 4K and 60 frames per second, so you can get slow motion in 4K. And for about $1,300, you can get the Lumix GH5, which has so many video features. I'll leave a link to a video talking about that. And so this is where Panasonic cameras really shine, is that for the price, they usually beat other brands in terms of video specs that they cram into the cameras. So now let's briefly talk about who I think this camera's for. And as I mentioned, I think this camera is for filmmakers. Anything where you're not afraid to set your own exposures, set your own focus, and go full manual, this camera will have your back. It has so many great video features and can shoot 4K. And so our final thought is, should you get the Lumix G7? Yes. If you're just starting out, absolutely. 100% though. And for test footage, all of my videos on my channel have been shot with the G7, so you can check those out if you want to see how this holds up. Thank you all for watching, and make sure to stay tuned for next week where we're going to have a full-on short film on the channel. Stay tuned for that. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.